That's the only reason. Welcome to the official unveiling of Magda, her journey, which was written frustratingly and annoyingly on 2 long-haul flights and in 2 weeks in Mexico by Magda herself. And as you read it, as I'm sure once you've heard Magda speak, as you read the book, you will hear her reading it to you. It's very much in her own voice, and it's very, very clearly a labor of considerable love and dedication into a life which starts in Poland and culminates in this very moment. This is the peak of existence. What has been the value of being underestimated?
The value of being underestimated? Do you think I've ever been underestimated?
I think you were for a long time. I think you were underestimated to the cost of many, many people, and we'll carry on with that. What's the value of being underestimated?
I think the value of being underestimated is that you can catch everyone by surprise when you succeed. And I've always had this theory of don't shout from the rooftops until you have something to shout about. And a good example of that was when we launched Signia in 2006. And I said to the guys, I ran African Harvest for 3 years. There was a lot of publicity, lots of media, lots of snipey comments of, women who shouldn't be where they are. And then when we launched Signia, I said to everyone, we will not go public until there's something to talk about. And then we didn't, we flew under the radar screens until we reached about 100 billion in assets. And then we, made a press release saying, here is Signia, and we exist, and we manage assets. And I expected, huge floods of phone calls and interest, and there was just deafening silence. And eventually, one journalist, kind of lonely voice, phoned and said, you are who? And you have how much? But I think, the value is you can catch people by surprise, and, hopefully, not dissimilarly, this book, not that, I was planning this book, I was kind of strong-armed by Penguin into writing it, but I kept it very quiet, and no one has read it up until its release. Literally no one, not even my husband, except for Penguin staff. So it is really my own voice.
Outside, you would have seen a sign that said sold out. Now, this is a sold out event by somebody who refused to sell out, but exposes in the book lots of other sellouts. And in her career, and I was going to ignore the book entirely and say, we're not going to talk about that, we're going to talk about your Twitter feed.
Let's talk about
and
Twitter
then
feed.
I started going through it, and there's 6,200 or so tweets. So I gave up on that, because it was just exhausting. But at what point did you stop pretending to be demure? If you've been underestimated, at some point that you start standing up for yourself. Was that at university? Was it at school? Was it when you went into your working life?
It definitely wasn't at school. I was mercilessly bullied at Paranoia High School for girls.
Why? Because you talked funny and you came from a foreign place?
I couldn't speak English. And teenage girls are a brutal force of nature. And then, UCT was a bit of a blur because I had to study, and I wasn't one of those people who were like naturally gifted. I was one of those people who had to graft, so I did. And then, probably my first campaign was, Southern Life. That was my first bursary job where I encountered kind of, sexual harassment. And I started kind of waging a war that's like, I've been working for 2 months. And I took on one of the very senior executives of the life insurance company. And literally waged the war against sexual harassment at Southern Life. But then I left after that.
But that's the problem with it, isn't it? I mean, you can stand up for yourself. Oh, good, yes, you've won, but you haven't won because you are the one who has to leave. I mean,
Indeed.
has to leave.
No. Look, I made the choice to leave, but it wasn't because of that. Okay. Actually, very sadly, and I think I talk about in the book, and let's just be clear, I don't blame men for a lot of things. think, women are equally to blame for not breaking through glass ceilings. And the Southern life experience was a bit of an eye-opener because, yes, I did wage this war, and yes, I was subsequently told, I'll be fired if I don't stop. But, that didn't make me stop. What made me stop was, I had this delegation of women who came to me. I mean, not a big one, but for women who came to me and said, Magda, if you think you're waging this war for us, please stop. We actually enjoy male attention. Why do you think we dress up in the morning to come to work? Why do you think we put on makeup? And if it comes up with some occasional behavior that crosses the line, well, so be it. And that is what made me stop waging the war, rather than anything else.
Growing up as you did in Poland, which seems largely in some ways idyllic, in the way it was also repressive and horrible. Talk to us about that exit from Poland, because it's a lovely story of determination of parents wanting something better for their children, and it's also a story of incredible hardship in terms of living in a refugee camp for a year. It's an astonishing tale.
Well, I think that the decision by my parents, and again, it talks to the fact that, all regimes, communism, apartheid, these regimes collapse, not because people have some Damascus moment, it's because literally governments run out of money to support unsustainable regimes. And that's where the change comes about. And the same thing happened with communism, this whole concept of free education, free healthcare, full employment, but everyone having exactly the same. So we had a 80 square meter apartment, which was the largest apartment you could get, but we had like 6 people living in that apartment.
2 comrade doctors in the house.
2 comrade doctors. Yeah. My sister, my brother, and my grandmother who took care of us. So eventually things started collapsing in terms of, mostly you saw it in food rationing. So there was no food. Imagine walking into a shop and there is nothing except for, and no one to this date has figured it out, vinegar. There were bottles and bottles of vinegar. So people would in the morning start queuing around shops, hoping that something will be delivered. And everyone was given postage stamps, which gave you some certain entitlement to say, 2 kilograms of sugar a month, 5 kilograms of meat a month. But you can't exactly eat postage stamps. So my father, who's always been a bit of, kind of impulsive individual, which I think, I've inherited from that from him. Unfortunately, my parents are not here, bad COVID, which they caught a couple of days ago. But he made the decision, I think literally, not overnight, but within kind of couple of weeks of saying, we're leaving. And, it wasn't that easy because communists, you didn't have passports. So you weren't allowed to leave the country. Or if you were allowed to leave the country, you had to get a special pass with the dates of departure and arrival back. And you had to leave, it was called a hostage behind. So you had to leave one close family member, a brother, a sister, a child, a spouse, behind to ensure that you would come back. So they wouldn't allow whole family units to leave. So my parents kind of hatched a bit of a plan, and I understand this is before the years of computers, so it wouldn't have worked if you had connectivity. But literally, my parents took myself and my sister on a trip around, kind of made-up trip around Europe. Really, it was kind of going to Italy. And then we came back, and at the same time, my grandmother and my brother applied for passes, which were kind of dated almost, kind of a couple of days before we arrived back. So they overlapped. And, we arrived back, packed a suitcase. My parents obviously didn't tell us that this is it. We are not coming back. Packed suitcases, and my mother, my sister, and I went on a train to Vienna, where the big refugee processing center was, the Transkirchen camp, which exists to this day. That's where the Syrians are kept. My father and brother and grandmother went in a small car. Different border, different time of crossing. So again, if there were computers, clearly none of this would have worked. And then we reunited at McDonald's in Vienna, my first exposure to McDonald's, my first exposure to chips, not a thing in Poland under communism. And then, you know, we arrived at Transkirchen at that stage, by the way, there were about 3 million refugees from Eastern European blocs who have left due to largely economic hardship. I mean, in our case, it was economics, it was the fact that my father was Jewish, and Poland remains a highly anti-Semitic country to this day, as they know. And then it became a political issue when, literally a couple of months after we left, Poland declared martial law. So the Communist Party clamped down on complete freedom and rolled out the tanks into the streets. Anyway, we arrived in this camp, you know, fingerprints taken, we were handed out blankets, we were given, you know, toothbrushes, and bunk beds. And the guy who was, I still remember, because, you know, he spent a couple of nights moaning, literally moaning, sorry, I was at derogatory. He walked all the way from the Ukraine, and he had gangrene. So this is how they, you know, packed people into these bunker beds, and then you had to wait. And during that wait time, you applied to various countries that took refugees: Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia. And, you know, you applied for official immigration as a refugee. Until you were accepted somewhere. And, you know, interestingly, we were accepted everywhere eventually. But, you know, if we had gone anywhere else, my parents wouldn't have had a job. So despite being medical doctors, it would have been a lot tougher. So what happened, but at the same time, South Africa, realizing, and by the way, these were South African mining companies and South African government, realized that in these refugee camps, they had you know, access to engineering skills, architects, medical doctors, musicians, cooks for the army, you name it. So they put up big posters saying, you know, they're recruiting. They opened up the embassy in Vienna. And, you know, my parents kind of applied. We got an interview. And all I remember of that interview is, you know, there was a guy dressed in because my parents eventually got a job with the first military hospital in Pretoria as doctors, and all I remember is this guy in like military uniform saying, "Were you communists? I just want to know, were you communists?" That was the sum total of the interview.
Are you sorry they chose South Africa? Sorry, please borrow a pen.
So, yes and no. Okay, so the no, you know, and it's a resounding no. Okay, so it's just not that simple. A resounding no, because, you know, we arrived in a country which is full of immigrants and different nationalities and different groups. And to be perfectly honest, we were embraced by South Africa. You know, there was not a moment, forget the bullying at Pretoria Girls High, you know, it's, you know, teenage girls. We were embraced by South Africa. There was never a moment where we felt discriminated against. My parents got jobs here. I got a bursary to study at university. And for me, literally it became a land of opportunity. You know, so there's nothing that I couldn't do in South Africa. You know, financial services industry, white male dominated, that's a feature of every financial services industry. And hence, you know, it is what it is. I don't feel that that's specific, you know, particular to South Africa, and that's why I had a tough time in South Africa. I didn't. So it gave me every opportunity in the world, even to the extent that, you know, when I really got my break, because the real break came when a gentleman by the name of Zico Malo, who was one of the military commanders of Umkhonto we Sizwe, bought a company called African Harvest. He thought it was a company. He didn't know it was bankrupt. And actually offered me the opportunity of running that company.
How did you connect with Zico Malo? Because you come from completely opposite ends of global world experience. Here's this guy spends time on Robben Island, who never reads a document, doesn't do any due diligences, kind of does stuff on a handshake and a prayer, and then throws you into the deep end and says, you run it, I'm off to go and do something else.
Look, I love the guy. So it's so Mzi is a character, larger than life character, and I left at the stage I met him. I left Coronation, and really it's a chapter I've put behind me. And Coronation taught me a lot.
She thinks I'm not going to go there, but I will. Carry on.
It's not that interesting. I taught a lot. I taught myself a lot during Coronation years. And then I left, and we started a small business with my husband. Again, there's a history to having to start that business. But we didn't really have a business. And it started getting very stressful because there were some people who walked out of Coronation with me, said to me, Magda, we'll work for you with no salary until you can pay us. And that sounds, you can pat yourself on the back. That lasts for exactly an hour before you go flipping hell. I've got people who are working here and they're not getting paid. And about 6 months into that journey, a friend of mine from Southern Life Days phoned me and said, Magda, let's go to lunch. And we went I met him in restaurant in, gosh, I can't remember the name, in Newlands, and Weinhuis. And I walked up to the table waving to Ethan, and walked up to him, and suddenly there is a gentleman sitting next to him, and you kind of vaguely recognize the face because Mzi was quite a well written about figure. For a variety of reasons. The main one
we'll go there in a moment too.
Yeah, we can go there. I love Mzi to bits to this day. And Mzi said to me, hi Magda, I'm Zico Malo. You have a business, I have a business, let's make a deal. Now, I knew I didn't have a business. I thought he had a business. Little did I know he didn't have a business. So literally overnight, and it was, by that weekend, I was at the lawyer's offices signing shareholding agreements. And then, literally a couple of weeks later walked into African Harvest.
And it was a mess.
And it was a mess. And it was a company in liquidation. He got conned into buying. To the extent that, the shareholding agreement, usually, when you sell something, and those of you that have entered in transactions, that you indemnify the buyer from your tax liabilities, from any risks, from any issues that might have occurred in the company pre-purchase. Whereas this agreement read, the buyer indemnifies the seller against seller's misdeeds in the past. That's how bad it was.
But Zico Malo was and remains, for those who remember, a controversial figure in light of the fact that he was one of the very first people to do an empowerment deal. Yes. He got Harmony shares, yes. And then he found a way to offload those really quickly, and he managed to get a big pile of cash.
Now, the issue is offload. So he did conclude a BE deal, and he was prohibited from selling the shares, physically selling the shares. But what he wasn't prohibited from doing, and it's a technical term, but he wasn't prohibited from shorting the shares. Okay. So in fact, he found a loophole of kind of selling the shares but not selling the shares. And nothing that he did was illegal in any way or in any way contravened the terms of the BE agreement. But remember what was on the table 1992, 1994. There was a transfer of of political power. There wasn't a transfer of economic power that happened in South Africa. And the fact that someone coming off Robben Island, and on Robben Island, Mzi always wanted to make money. He was very clear that when he studied through UNISA, very clear that he went, when he comes out of prison, he's going to make money. And it wasn't on the table that the first BE deal, one of the first BE deals, the guy shorts the shares and makes 1 billion rand overnight. And so the backlash of someone who literally outsmarted the people he entered into the transaction with was what it was.
Show us your watch.
Which one? This one?
That one.
Oh, I'm having to remove my hairbands.
Is that the watch?
That's the watch.
That's the watch. It's a platinum Rolex.
Rolex.
Which you bought for yourself.
Indeed.
When you sold African Harvest.
When I sold African Harvest.
And by this time, Zico Malo was living in London.
Indeed.
And you go for dinner and you go, look at my new watch. And
I
he,
said to him,
and he
"New
says
watch."
to you, oh, Magda, you don't know how to be rich.
He looked at the watch.
What did he mean by that?
He looked at the watch. He kind of turned it around. He said, Magda, you really don't know how to be rich. What he meant is, you should have gone to Switzerland and had a custom-made watch, not something you buy off the shelf. But, at the same dinner, and like Mzi likes having kind of late night dinners where, it's kind of midnight and you're going, please, please stop eating. I said to him, Mzi, he those days had a private plane. I said, Mzi, are you not like on your way to the airport? You're supposed to fly back to South Africa. He said to me, Magda, one thing is certain. That plane is not leaving without me.
So he fell into his desire to be rich really quickly and quite comfortably.
Very.
And knew how to be rich.
You know what? I always, and I think I write about it in the book. I don't know whether I write about everything, but I met him in Durban one day. It was winter, so it was dark quite early on, and he picked me up in his sports Bentley at the airport. And he said to me, Magda, I'm going to show you where I come from. And he comes from, this kind of very violent township outside of Durban, which his grandfather used to run with an iron fist. So as Mzi used to say, no one crossed his grandfather twice. So I kind of went, that's it. Okay, we are getting hijacked, we are getting killed, we are getting robbed. And he took this car and then we started bumping along the potholes in the township. And he pulled up to a petrol station. So I go, okay, that's it. My last minute on earth has just come. And people came out of shacks and greeted him and waved. And he said to me, because I said to him, Mzi, you are forever in debt. You are forever entering into crazy transactions. You don't read what you sign. And he said to me, Magda, I will not be buried in my money. I will spend it all before I die.
Do you plan to do the same?
You know what? I wouldn't be able to tell you how much money I have at the moment because money has never been a very big thing in my life. And I know it's
Sorry, just one point on that.
Yeah, I know.
Do you know what rich people have in common? The one thing they have in common. They say to you, money doesn't matter anymore. They always leave out anymore.
There's no anymore.
But that's the point. I mean, it is, once you've cracked it, and you have cracked it, you did well out of African Harvest.
Indeed.
You created Signia, you have partially listed Signia, and you've been able to capitalize on the innovation and the creation of a differentiated financial services offering in South Africa. So deadly seriously. And frankly, the money doesn't matter. But what does matter is you get to a point, and I'm curious as to how this is informed by your experience in Austria, in a refugee camp, because you were there for nearly a year, I think. So you would have had and you're 13 years old. This is a massively formative time in your life. And you're watching South Africa go down the toilet in the Zuma years, and you get quite cross. And I wonder if that quite cross is amplified by the fact that I can't go through this crap again. I wonder.
So I think there are lots of reasons. So when I say money doesn't matter, first of all, I grew up in communism. Everyone is equal. So the level of inequality in this country is a very jarring thing for me. So that's one. Two, I've always worked hard, and I've always believed that, look, if I lose all my money tomorrow, I'll just earn it again. Maybe whatever it is, I'll just work. I'm working now. I work running 2 businesses at the moment, or helping to run Signia and running a business in the UK and starting another business in South Africa. So my belief is, stuff it. If I lose all the money tomorrow, I'll make it up.
This lady in blue over here just went, she started choking, going, how? And maybe we'll come back to the quite cross thing, because this is a slight deviation. But that is the point of people who have got an industrious nature, people who've got a creator's mindset, people who, if it goes wrong, that's terrible. But you learn from that, move on and go and do something else.
you move on and start something else. And, as long as I've got my brain, as long as I've got the energy and two hands, and then two children that I've educated very well, so if I'm too old, hopefully they'll support me, I'm good. The other feature of being immigrants is that, or refugees, is that you always have a sense that you're living on suitcases. And what I mean by that is that you never lose that sense that you would have to pick up your suitcases, pack up overnight, exactly what we did in Poland, and have to make a run for it. And, I also saw, sorry, it's a long story, but it's multifaceted, a long answer to your question. And then I saw how my parents, coming here at the age of 40 or so, struggled to replicate a life, to integrate into the society, how their friends largely remain Polish friends, and how difficult it is. So by the time, I became more, look, my political kind of awakening happened, or education happened under MZ. Because, I got a hell of a lot of insights into almost, anything ANC. And, when Zuma took over at Polokwane, Z driving out of Polokwane was in a rage, and he phoned me. I just started Signia, and he said to me, Magda, a gallery of rogues has taken over my ANC. And then, so there was that, and as a data point. And then, being in investments, we could see the economy spiraling downwards sooner than others did. And then I faced this concept of we're living on suitcases again. So I have to say something, because, if we don't change things, I'm packing up my suitcases. And I don't want to pick up the suitcases, because I know how hard it is at that stage of your life. And that's when I started kind of speaking out. And obviously, the fact that I ran my own company, so no one could tell me what to do. Okay, so
that's an advantage, yes.
That's a humongous advantage. I'm not a typical CEO. I wasn't in a position like a CEO of an average company or any other company where they are an employee with a salary, with a bonus, with some option scheme, responsible to the board of directors and responsible for the profit line. They don't have the mandate to take on the government, for goodness sake. They have government contracts. We don't have any government contracts. So I had this amazing, platform to basically say anything I wanted. So something had to be said. Someone had to start talking. I mean, of course, when I started talking, I expected that, I'll look right, I'll look left, and I'll be surrounded by other leaders of industry doing the same. Little did I know that, I looked around, I'm like the lonely voice in the wilderness.
And for a long time, it was like that. Because you started doing some really interesting things in terms of there are several financial scandals that you wondered how they had happened, and various ones, and you'd spend a weekend going through financial statements and finding the gaps. This is your actuarial science training coming through and saying, hold on a second, but we've got an entire financial services industry that employs thousands of supposedly the smartest people available who are trained by the best professors at the best universities in South Africa, and somehow they're missing, which to you in retrospect is bleedingly blooming obvious. What's wrong with the financial services industry?
Lots. The financial services industry, and you're using the example of Net1, and that was the company that was basically, using the...
Stealing poor people's money through grants.
Stealing people's poor, the grants scam. So they were, while the grant recipients were queuing to get the grants, they were selling them, like funeral insurance, astronomical microloans. It was basically microloans at like 200% interest. It was just outrageous, the way the scam was perpetuated. And Net1 as a company listed on the JSE, listed in the US, grew. The problem with asset management industry is that the people who analyze companies are in their 20s. They're young. They can analyze a balance sheet. They can analyze an income statement. They can pretend to talk to management who usually can snow them, as you can imagine. You've got a 25-year-old pretending to analyze a company, and you've got a CEO who is 50 years old, who wins, who lies, who believes. I think it's the fact that people, and most people, and there's and that's not a criticism of anything, most people want to leave lead peaceful lives. And, I've kind of divided the society into kind of three segments. There's obviously the crooks, the people on the left who do whatever they do, and, they've got no morality whatsoever. You've got the vast amount of people in the middle who kind of know no evil, see no evil, hear no evil. They want to lead linear lives. They want to lead simple lives. They don't want the complexity and the issues that come with being controversial. And then you've got these crazy people on the right who step over the line and are prepared to take on whatever is coming. And if you say to me, what is the motivation? Well, one is, and that's, I think, in the DNA. There is kind of a sense of moral outrage that drives you at seeing these things.
Lots of people are outraged. Most thinking people are outraged by injustice and by corruption and all of these things, but it does take something different to act on that outrage. What's that difference?
I think it's the outrage, it's the moral compass. And someone just a week ago said to me, it's also that kind of sense of community or sense for community. So doing things for others, not necessarily for yourself. And I don't know whether that's actually right. I mean, I derive huge sense of self-validation. I don't need validation from other people, but I do need, as we all do, validation from somewhere. And that validation comes from within me. And that validation is premised on things that I do and not on the money I make, because as I said, that neither here nor there. It comes from the fact that I can look at myself in the mirror and say, I've done something right.
But is there a sense of loss that plays there, based on refugee camp time and parents who arrive who've given up everything to make a change, and you've built up considerable value in a relatively short period of time, and that could be taken away from you if you have to get off that suitcase and carry it off to the airport. That sense of, actually, stuff you. You're not going to take this away from me.
No. You know what? That, interestingly, never ever, until you've raised it now, has never actually featured. But, about whatever it was, 10 years ago, or not even, say 5 years ago, I kind of made a slightly controversial appointment at Signia, and it involved, I needed to calm people down. I brought in an industrial psychologist to talk to people about the hire I've made. And this guy said to me afterwards, can he chat to me for 10 minutes?
The industrial psychologist
the
or the bad
psychologist,
guy?
The industrial psychologist. He said to me, because he wants to understand the choice that I've made here, because that never happens, almost never happens. And he wants to understand why I've made the choice. I said to him, okay, I'll happily give you 10 minutes and give you my potted background. And he said to me, he thinks that the decisions I make in life are a function of my non-linear childhood. So, for most of us, or for most of you, your childhood would have been happy childhood with parents, you had a group of friends, you had primary school, you had high school, and actually if I asked any one of you in this room, what were you doing at the age of 12? You wouldn't remember. If I said, what were you doing at the age of 12 and 13? You might have a vague memory of, well, I think, maybe, but then 14 was the same as 13. Whereas, I live in very discrete chapters. My life is, I remember the day we were on the plane to South Africa. I remember the journey in the car from the airport to Franschhoek nursing hospital. I remember everything that happened in Austria. I have vivid memories of, because it was so jagged and not linear. And, his psychological belief was, if you want a psychological opinion here, or professional opinion, that the choices I make are a function of that kind of non-linear upbringing.
But you don't just sit and snipe. You don't just sit and publish opinion pieces in Business Day, which are very powerful and valuable and have positive results. You also get embroiled in what becomes the Gupta email scandal.
Yeah.
Daily Maverick needs some money. And they say to you, can you give us some money, please? And you say, what for? And they say, for this. And you go, and you give them some money. And you then go off to London for 2 weeks or a week, because you work quite fast.
7 days.
And you go through this stuff and you go, oh my word. Then you phone up Branko Brinkic and you say, when are you publishing? And he goes, I'm summarizing. He goes, when we're ready. And we are now in about April,
May.
May
2017,
of 2017. There's the ANC elective conference coming up in December. There's a great big clock ticking. And you go, okay, please can you print now? And he went, when we're ready, because we need to make damn sure that we get this right. And you then decide, no, actually, this information needs to be shared. And you make him quite cross. And you share more widely the files of information. Was it the right thing to do?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the sequence was slightly different. He did approach me for money, whistleblower, fly whistleblower to safety. Look, there was a lawyer involved, I had legal privilege, my name was never supposed to be mentioned in any forum, which that, skanky lawyer decided to break privilege, but it is what it is. And then I was presented at that stage with the journalist's plan of, the timelines, which were very lengthy, and I don't want to say anything bad about either Daily Maverick or Amam Mungani. They are journalists, they do the best they can, but they have an objective, which there are New York journalists right now being criticized for Trump tapes for exactly the same, sitting on recordings for 12 months before writing a book. And those recordings were, very, very valid or relevant to the various committees that were, being run by Congress. Anyway, so I listened. I didn't know what I was going to do with this trove of emails, which I had in my possession. I was told that there's enough there to bring down Zuma. There wasn't enough to bring down Zuma. Zuma never signs a single piece of paper. He only operates on cell phones, and other people's cell phones, by the way, not his own. And then I heard via that the news of the fact that that trove of information or emails exists in a public domain, and that actually people are at risk. And the only place that could have come from is the fact that Branko was putting together a team of journalists and making a lot of noise around this. So I got legal opinion, most senior counsel in the land, and I was told, democratize this information as quickly as you can. Just make it public before people start dying, and in fact, your family is at risk. And the best advice I can give you, get yourself out of the country within 2 days. Because if the Guptas, you have 2 days before the Guptas find out that, this information is in your possession and few hands. So I flew out, took my family out of South Africa. I went to London. I went to see the Panama Papers journalists in Sweden because I thought that they could, do this. And the guy said to me, looked at the whole thing, says, look, South Africa, tip of Africa, we're actually not that interested. Too much effort. We can't do it quickly, and we certainly can't do it within the timelines that you would like us to do. Then I tried WikiLeaks, and that's a very, very dodgy kind of platform. You can't upload anything onto WikiLeaks. I got so frustrated that I had this drive, and I actually walked up to the Ecuadorian embassy. Actually, I have a photo. I took a selfie. And I had this view of taking this drive and actually just throwing it through the Assange's window. And then I found out about Edward Snowden lawyer. I met him in Paris, and he also said to me, just distribute as quickly as you can. So that's when I spent 7 days locked up in a hotel room. But, karma is, I booked myself into a standard hotel room in Beaton Four Seasons in London. I got upgraded to presidential suite.
You needed room to work. There was lots of paper to spread around.
7 days, went through all those emails, and there was a lot of gumph. And frankly, if I don't see another photograph of a naked lady, I'll die happy. And so, and I grouped, there was a lot of gumph. And I grouped those emails into things that made sense: Eskom, Transnet, Denel, Estina, and then I made copies, like in wearing rubber gloves, by the way. This was like Spy 101. So there are no fingerprints and, hair tied back.
But
it was crazy stuff.
Was that paranoia justified? I mean, that level of anguish, not paranoia, but that level of anguish, was
You
it
know what?
justified?
I think the moment the information was out there, everyone was safe because then any kind of retaliation would be just that revenge. You know, it would no longer be about the information; it would be about revenge. But you know, as a and I don't know if it's as a consequence of being outspoken, as a consequence of Gupta leaks. But you know, then I was placed under state surveillance. I had Tony Leon is here. Tony invited me to some lunch where I did some speech in Oranje, Tony. I don't know if you remember. There were at least three.
Tony forgets nothing.
Tony forgets that. Tony, there were at least three state security agents who followed me. God, were they obvious. I mean, everywhere you turn, they were the same guys.
What's scarier, that they're so rubbish at their job, or that they were doing the job in the first place?
You know what? I mean, first they were rubbish at their job. I mean, obviously, by that stage, I had bodyguards, which was not a pleasant experience. They were rubbish at their job because you could see the same faces all the time. They tapped our phones, so what you don't know. So more kind of unpleasant stuff was not the fact that because these were illegal taps, and I believe that the technology was obtained from Russia, so you could actually hear them come on the line. As I answered the phone, there was a click, and then the voice, deteriorated. But what was interesting in those times is that whenever there was a meeting of any substance that was held, be it a legal meeting, we all had to leave cell phones outside. No cell phones were allowed into the room, because obviously they can be used as listening devices. And, in my office, I bought, I don't know whether I used it many times, I've used it a few times, but I bought kind of, again, under the table legal means, one of those cell phone blockers, so that you can, switch it on, block cell signal.
But, I mean, you don't talk about global spy agencies and things in the book, but there was some involvement, wasn't there? I mean, there was FBI connections, there were all sorts of other...
Well, you need to democratize the data. So you democratize the data. I mean, not just talking about South Africa, you democratize the data.
I mean, and the point is, these are global crooks who have global attention, crooks. And glable agencies are
so they've been placed on US sanctions list, so that list is successful. I think FBI was interested in them to the extent that their money touched the US dollar. MI6 guys don't look at James Bond. Such a disappointment.
Oh.
Such a disappointment.
I'm sure they're very nice and polite, though.
Lovely. Such a disappointment. I was expecting so much more.
It's Hollywood. Destroys everything. We need to wrap up, and I'll get a few questions asked. But I look at this whole book, and it's a book of a woman driven by purpose, driven by a passion to make a difference, to shake up a financial services industry she perceives to be, whether you perceive it to be unjust or not, I'm not sure, but you certainly see an opportunity to shake the tree and say, we can do it differently. And you talk about how entrepreneurs, to be successful, must innovate. They must change something, otherwise you're simply replicating, and what the hell's the point of that? And Signia was one of the first to go into passive products and into, to bring the world of opportunity really to investors.
Indeed. So look, I mean, to me, innovation is about everything. And, I'll take you back to that question, which, I left kind of hanging, which is, do I regret the fact that my parents came to South Africa versus somewhere else? And, I've managed to, in my small little way, disrupt things in South Africa and really, a small little way, disrupt financial services, hopefully, for the better. But, I always think if I had been in the United States of America, maybe I could have been Elon Musk.
Could it be? It worked for him. It worked for him. Ladies and gentlemen, from the floor, any questions? Yes, sir. Be careful. The microphone is making its way to you. If you could speak into it, please. There we go.
Thank you for a very entertaining talk, and your memoir is going to be very interesting to read. You mentioned your father was Jewish, and I was wondering how he or his parents, your grandparents, survived the Holocaust. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
So, I described the way they survived the Holocaust in the book. They escaped. They were born in Lvov, which is now part of Ukraine. Then it was part of Poland. their entire families died in the concentration camps. But they managed to, my grandfather, you know, the Russians, because very few people know that in terms of World War II, Germany wasn't the only aggressor. Germany and Russia agreed ahead of time, Ribbentrop and Molotov pact involved Russia and Germany attacking Poland at the same time and splitting Poland in half, which they did. But the Russians, when they came in, they shot literally the entire top of Polish army. So they killed 20,000 officers and generals and buried them in Katyn forest in Poland. In fact, they denied till 1990s when they had finally admitted it was them and not the Germans. But my grandfather, who was a Jewish doctor, said, you know, he will not be killed like a dog by the Germans. He will die with a gun in his hand. And he joined the Russian army because there was no Polish army to join, and he was then captured. But he was a very, very good doctor, and so they used him as a medical doctor in the camp. And the day before, the Germans were withdrawing because the Germans have, you know, overstepped, attacked the Russians were advancing. His boss told him that next day they'll be killing everybody in the camp. They're killing all the prisoners, and they're withdrawing. So if he's going to run, he must run. And my grandmother, and there's a long story as to why she was kind of living outside of the camp, managed to dress him up as a woman and smuggle him out of the camp. And that is really how they survived. And then the Russians came in, they wouldn't release them because, again, my grandfather was too good a medical doctor. But eventually 47 came, and my grandfather kind of said he wants to go back to Poland. You know, this is now Russia. So they released him, but they wouldn't release my grandmother because she lived till 95. And tremendous linguist. So she, by that stage, spoke Russian, you know, fluently. And they said to her, "Rubbish, you're Russian, you know, you've got St. Petersburg accent." So she clawed her way all the way up the bureaucracy to the person who headed up Ukraine at that stage, the region, to actually get her permission to leave, and that was Khrushchev. So Khrushchev allowed my grandparents to go back to Poland.
Do you liken the conflict? Do you thrive on the conflict?
It's not the conflict. It's very funny that you say that because, you know, I went to Bulalani's talk yesterday and met some people, some people I know, and among them kind of Hermione Cronier, who just left NPA. And I just said, we've got to do something. There must be a new movement for change that we need to start because
the revolution begins in
the revolution, because I cannot actually, you know, watch this anymore. No. You know, I've kind of stepped away in 2000. You know, I did what I did, and then I kind of decided to focus on business, and I thought things would improve after, you know, Cyril took power. Things have not improved. Things have degenerated, and they continue to degenerate. And I actually said to Simon, my husband, walking out of that session yesterday, that actually what gives, you know, what makes, you know, when I feel adrenaline is when I think that things can be done and I can make a difference. And I had that sense yesterday again. So I'm back. I just need to find a platform.
Like Arnold Schwarzenegger, great accent, and she's back. Zondo, any value?
Enormous amount of value in terms of the amount of rot. You know, it was a little bit like and appreciated for what it is. It was a truth and reconciliation. I'm not sure about the reconciliation bit. It was the truth portion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have heard most of it. It is there, it is in evidence, people have testified, people have come forward. The reconciliation, I don't think South Africa can ever reconciliate itself to what has happened and what continues to happen. The bit where people will go to jail, no. Do I believe Zuma will ever see jail? No. Do I actually care? No.
Why don't you care?
Because, you know, we only have so much bandwidth, okay, as all of us. And there are only so many things that we can do. And we can either keep looking at the past, and NPA is a mess, by the way, looking at the past and trying to, and throw all our energy into trying to somehow change history, which is the woke movement, by the way. Or you can look forward and try and make a change going forward. And if I'm going to, dedicate any bandwidth, energy-wise, in terms of what I do, it is fixing things, not looking backwards and try and punishing I just don't have that much energy.
No.
I would rather focus my energy on forward, not on the past.
You have on social media said that you don't believe that South Africa is a place where successful businesses can be built anymore. Yet you said a little while ago you've got Signia, of course. You've got the business in London. Remind me.
Bravos Venture Capital.
And then you said you've got another business in South Africa.
Starting. A little bit of it.
So explain that contradiction to me then, because on one hand you're on social media saying, "Oh my God, it's a mess," and on the other hand you're going, "Okay, let's start something new," which is great, but why?
It's a contradiction. I think right now South Africa is not a land of opportunity, which doesn't mean that in 5 years' time it can't be a land of opportunity.
Right.
So if people step up, if people literally, and it's again, I'm sorry to be quoting Praveen, but if people organize, if there is that sense of community, because by the way, I'm a firm believer that we've got to give up on believing that the government can run this country. It's actually communities will have to run this country. Literally communities will have to organize and run the country. And if that means, we pay to fix our own potholes, that's the truth. We will have to fix our own potholes. But communities are a very powerful force. And, that the fact that I said right now, South Africa is not an investable destination. Well, it isn't. The level of corruption, the bribes you have to pay. Signia could have been 5 times bigger than it is.
If you just managed it properly and paid the
people. If I just paid the middlemen.
You've let your shareholders down.
If you just paid the middlemen.
Yeah.
And someone, said to me, and someone who has been involved in looking at corruption in South Africa in great amount of detail, and they said to me that there is virtually not a single government contract that has been granted where a bribe has not been paid by a corporate in South Africa. That's not a land of opportunity. Yeah. But it does not mean that you can't change it.
We were in about May of 2017 when the Gupta emails dropped. You've now come to start a revolution in Franschhoek in May of this year. Coincidentally, it is also the year of another elective conference. Are you motivated by that?
No, God, no.
Okay.
I'm motivated by the fact that, look around. Where will you find a more beautiful country in the world? Just look around. Look around Cape Town, look around this valley. I said to my husband yesterday, we should be buying a house here. In a space where, you want to live in nature. Anyway, this is a country worth fighting for. And it's not about what are the politics of the moment, what are the national elections here and there. It is about, what platforms can you form that somehow have a voice, and a voice that is heard. And that's really the challenge. It was easy in 2017 because there was kind of a deafening silence. No one was speaking. Now we have Zonda, as we've got all that evidence. We know what is possible in terms of white-collar crime. So the challenge really is to come up with constructive ideas for how to change it, because I don't want to abandon South Africa. I would like at some stage for my kids to say, actually, we want to come back.
I choose to come back. Yeah.
I choose to come back to South Africa because it is a land of opportunity. It's the most beautiful country in the world that I have seen, and we have traveled everywhere. Ideally, you don't want to live anywhere else, but you also do not want to live with failing water infrastructure. You do not want to live without electricity, for God's sake. It's
and you can't have a sustainable society that is as unfair as South Africa is to most of its people.
Yeah. You cannot have that lack of basic education. Make me a minister of education for a month, and I promise you I will resolve the education problem in this country.
All right, then.
I swear to God. 1 month. Give me 1 month.
Does financial statements in a weekend, government department 1 month, go to 12 government departments in 12 months, will be sorted. Have you got some time? If people hypothetically would be interested in buying this thing, of scribbling in their books for them.
Absolutely, no problem.
Would you like to do it outside? Because we've got to clear the room,
yes.
unfortunately,
okay.
because for the next session. But ladies and gentlemen, please, a very big round of applause for Magda Wierzycka.